Welcome to Disclosure with Dr. Stephen Greer. In this episode, we explore the levels of consciousness, cosmology, and technology. Welcome, Dr. Greer.
Thank you. Glad to be with you again.
Thank you. You talk about the conscious holographic universe. Can you walk us through that?
Yes, I think it's really important for people to understand that right now you and I are awake and we're conscious, and everyone listening. That conscious mind, whereby you're awake, is actually an infinite field of awareness. We're only identifying it with ourselves, but in reality, it's always infinite and unbounded. And the reason we end up not identifying with the infinite, unbounded aspect of it is that we have been trained only to be focused on our own, what's right in front of us. So when you go into meditation, you can experience deeper, quiet consciousness, and then in that state, you can see remote places. That's remote viewing, or being a seer. You can see the future, and that's precognition. You can see other realms, the so-called worlds of light, astral, celestial, other dimensions, higher and lower. And you can perceive also the very structure of the cosmos, where the first emanations from the field of consciousness are beginning to emerge. And those first emanations are the tonality of thought. It's the sound component of thought. Interestingly, that's what a mantra is, chanting. But if you look at it from a structure of the cosmos point of view, it's that you have this impulse that emerges, that is itself conscious and consciousness. And that first emergence from the unbounded field of consciousness is the plane of the absolute, as the mystics call it. There's this stimulation, this initial thought from the Great Spirit, and it's called the primal thought. And that primal thought and tonality, that then differentiates into all that exists in the cosmos, in creation, not just the material 3D, but all the worlds of light, all that exists. So that primal thought is constantly there. It's not like it came and went. It's a continuous presence. That then unfolds into the specific tonality, thought essence that's conscious within all things. So this primal thought then goes like a fractal into an infinite number of expressed things, stars, people, rocks, everything has this within it. So standing within every single point in space, time, or object is the unbounded consciousness, because all this is that, this emanation of tonality, primal thought, that then differentiates into that specific object. From there, you have the emanation of light. So the first emanation of light from the primal thought has been called the most great light. But from that most great light, you then have the expression into the light within all things. So then at that point, this emanation of the pure light form that's undifferentiated then becomes the worlds of light, they're called. And this can be all the different dimensions, higher, lower, angelic, celestial, to the very highest level. Now the highest level of the expressed is very, very close to that most great light primary emanation. So what happens is then from there, you have a template that interfaces, that creates time, space, matter, 3D. So I think for us to understand these extraterrestrial civilizations, we have to understand a new cosmology. So now let's talk about the technologies. If you're going to go from one point in space and time to another beyond the speed of light, you're traversing along, I call it the underbelly of the cosmos, but you have actually trans-dimensionally shifted into the astral or near astral. And people think this is so hard to understand, but think about it. Most people have had a lucid flying dream where they see a place or a future. Well, how does that happen? It's because the consciousness within us And our deeper, subtle bodies are not as fixed in space and time and intellect as we normally associate, and therefore you can see a distant place, a distant time, a future event, a past event. So that is very much involved with extraterrestrial technologies, have those abilities that this cosmos that I'm talking about is actually utilized more fully. Let's say a fuller spectrum is used by interstellar civilizations than we are now on Earth. So that's really important. So now you get into this whole question of extraterrestrial spacecraft and civilizations and people. Yes, they can appear full 3D, but they could be hovering outside your window in 5D. What's interesting about this, I call this the gap in between, this interface between 3D and these other dimensions. And in that gap is a lot going on of where the material cosmos and what we call physical sciences can begin to interface with these more subtle, finer refinements, very fine versions of electromagnetism that are beyond the speed of light and matter into the near interface, where the astral, so-called, conscious light energy becomes form and matter. That is very much the mastery that happens between the science of consciousness and all its expressions and 3D physical sciences like we think of today on Earth. And that's our future. I mean, that's why I say the science of consciousness being integrated with physical understanding instead of it either or, it's going to be an integrated system.
Do you think that some of these ET civilizations live in other dimensions, actually live there, and then can just phase shift their frequency to walk into our dimension?
Well, if they're from a physical planet and a physical spacecraft, they traverse these other dimensions and can reside in those dimensions as long as they wish or not. That's why it isn't just while during transport. They can be outside the building here, shifted beyond the speed of light in the near astral or in the gap, or partially in this dimension, or fully in the astral. Now, as you go through more advanced civilizations, the technologies track the level of consciousness of the planet as they evolve in higher states of consciousness.
Dr. Greer, you've highlighted the hierarchy of the states of consciousness for beings. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, and I think it's important to understand it because this is the path all of us are on. Now, what I'm going to describe is, again, sounding like a linear process, when in reality, various states of consciousness begin to overlap and unfold, so certain aspects of it will be happening all the time. But, the basic ones, everybody's aware of being awake, sleeping, dreaming. And then there's another one, and the basic one is in meditation. Our society ignores this, is being in that transcendent state of samadhi, where you're just aware of awareness. You're not aware of your thoughts, yourself. You're in this very peaceful unboundedness of being awake. So it's the nothingness of being infinitely awake, not the nothingness of being asleep and dark. So that experience is something that you can have spontaneously or through the practice regularly of meditation and understanding that. By the way, all meditation techniques should be designed to get you to that point where the meditation technique stops. The technique is just getting you to a place where you can let go and where the individuality of your individual soul can merge with this unbounded field. And so from there, what's interesting, as you go through the development of higher states of consciousness, intentionally engaging in meditation and study and various techniques, you will at some point experience cosmic consciousness, as it's been termed, which is when you're aware of that unbounded conscious field, even while you're driving, walking, what have you. And this develops slowly for most people, but the key hallmark of it is you're aware of that unbounded conscious state from having been immersed in it in meditation enough, even while you're awake and dreaming and sleeping. And so then you open up the whole richness of dream time, as Aboriginals in Australia call it, where you have these experiences even in the dream state, which, again, most people have that even before they're established in cosmic consciousness.
Yeah.
So you can have transitory cosmic consciousness experiences that come and go, but it being established all the time is when you're fully in that state all the time.
Right.
As that is established, and while it's being established, you spontaneously begin to develop more and more ability to have what's called celestial perception. And the perception, literally physically and within your mind, of these resonant frequencies that cross over into astral, all the way to celestial, and eventually to the divine, we call it Godhead, or the God consciousness state of that being. Then there's another state, it's a little more abstract, where you actually perceive everything as pure consciousness. And you usually need to have someone who's experienced that to sort of say, yeah, that's what that is, because it's incredibly subtle. But where you actually see everything as so it's unbounded consciousness within and unbounded consciousness out. And those become one. That's why it's called unity consciousness. There's this woven together where your direct perception of the world around you is that it is all consciousness. Very, very high state of consciousness. And then there's a state beyond that, Brahman consciousness, as it's been termed. And this is more universal consciousness, where you as an individual experience the consciousness of the entire creation. And the reason they're important is that these have corollaries not only into CE5 contact, but the kinds of civilizations we interact with.
Dr. Greer, what are the technological corollaries to these cities that you mentioned?
Yeah, and this is really where the rubber meets the road in terms of CE5 contact and this subject. So everyone's heard about, the CIA remote viewing projects and all of that. Those are the low-tech ones. But that actually gets, when you get a really developed civilization, or some of the more developed classified projects, those capabilities get, I call it routinized, where it's made routine scientifically through technological systems that interface with consciousness and thought. So this is where you get into the technology-assisted consciousness, where your consciousness can be assisted in remote viewing or seeing the past or the future through a technological system. And ETs have those devices because ET systems involve the ability to drop out of space-time linearity and be able to see things past, now, or future. Caveat, anything that's perceived in the future is only a probable future. The reason charlatans are always going to say on October 15th, XYZ is going to happen, is that by the time they utter it and see it, it can change the timeline or whether it will happen or not. So when you're talking about future, except for very big events that are sort of fixed, you're talking about the probability. Now the probability may be 99%. It's never 100% when you're talking off the right now or what's already happened. Everything that's happened in the past and happening now is engraven within the structure of these other dimensions and consciousness, and is always going on. Now, so here's an example of that. One of my military advisors was at the White Oaks Naval Facility in Maryland before it closed, and this was back in the 70s, and they had a device, a naval intelligence, where it was called they could extract from what they call the white noise of space-time anything that had ever happened in any volume of space. So they could target, say, the space where this building is and see what's going on right now, or what happened last night, or what happened 1,000 years ago in this space, or happened 1,000,000 years ago, with absolute accuracy. And that was in, I think, 73 for that era. And it had been around a while. But those technologies, imagine what interstellar civilizations that have been going interstellar for hundreds or thousands or millions of years, they have generation 5,000 of this stuff. So just keep that in mind. So, and then you get into things like, for example, levitation. I've talked about the fact that a city that develops and can happen spontaneously is the ability to levitate. Well, how is that really happening? Well, when you're in a certain state of meditation, and it's sort of also connected to the heart and joy, it creates an And the heart has, 30, 40,000 neurons, by the way, and is electromagnetic, as is the brain, as is the whole body. You can alter the angular momentum and spin of all your molecules and atoms so you lift up. You click it a little further, you will dematerialize and disappear and appear somewhere else. This can all be done by developing higher states of consciousness, and everyone's read accounts of enlightened masters who could do this. Now there's a corollary to that. Obviously anti-gravity. Well, they're using an electromagnetic, very high voltage system to create the same effect that a very high consciousness state can affect. It's all both levitation of material objects. Similarly, when you get into these consciousness-assisted technologies, you can actually have consciousness that is interfacing with your technologies so that you teleport or materialize or lift things at a distance. That can be done technologically, and ETs have that. And then you have things like full-on teleportation. Now, those experiments began in the 40s, 50s. One of the disclosure witnesses was at an Air Force base in 53, where they were teleporting solid objects from one part of the base to another, and it would go from one electronic system to another and go boom, boom. And that was 53. So we know that that can be done technologically, but it can also be done, as I mentioned, through the cities and the higher states of consciousness. You see, there's a pattern here. Almost everything you've heard about that is a innate ability in consciousness can be made routine, routinized through scientific discovery, and has been, frankly. And the same thing, dematerialize, rematerialize. Now, in the ET systems and classified projects, these are trans-dimensional interstellar craft have to be able to drop out of 3D materialization, go through these other dimensions, they're called trans-dimensional, and appear at another point in space-time. And in a sense, they can create their own portals. So everyone thinks you have to have a pre-existing portal. Actually, CE5 groups, we are creating our own portal right above what we're doing. And the same thing with, you hear of masters who can materialize a ruby or an object.
Right.
Well, a little bit like Star Trek, ET civilizations, their manufacturing of their craft is through these trans-dimensional energy fields, and the reason when you see an actual ET craft, there aren't any parts to it. And in fact, the material in it is so pure that even in space we haven't been able to replicate the purity. Why? It's because it is materialized. It is brought in from, let's call them the elementals of this gap, from the near astral to the physical, and it is then resonantly, ultrasonically, and resonant fields brought into 3D. So that's an electronic system, but a very refined one. And that's how they materialize things. And then, you have other types of experiences, bilocation, trilocation. It means that an ET craft can be in multiple places at once. Now, enlightened masters have been able to bilocate and meet with more than one of their students at the same time. You hear these accounts. Well, it's the same thing in consciousness, but then made routine through electronic systems, because in reality, like the spooky effect Einstein talked about, you can have the same particle in two places at once. You can do the same thing, not just with a particle, but an entire spacecraft. And then you get into things like remote healing event. A wonderful doctor, Larry Dossey, did the book Recovering the Soul about remote prayer and healing events that they've been studied. And humans can do that. And as you go into higher states of consciousness or understand the power of consciousness and prayer, you can affect outcomes and help people heal at a distance. Well, there are electronic corollaries to that are using the consciousness field. So interstellar civilizations have that and can do amazing healing with it.
You speak about the 10 levels of civilizations, and can you speak on that? And also, where are we going as a civilization?
Oh, well, the latter part of the question, we're headed off a cliff if we don't change directions. As the Chinese proverb says, unless we change directions, we're likely to end up where we are going. And so we need a course correction. But civilizations that are interstellar, in order to cross the threshold where we are, where, we have these fearsome weapon systems that could eliminate all life on Earth.
Yeah.
And not just hydrogen, nuclear bombs, but others that are classified. So human civilization's at a level 0. We're basically not yet a real civilization. We're trying to get there. But eventually a civilization has to reach a level 1 or they self-destruct. And that the hallmark of a level 1 civilization is that it's a peaceful global civilization where all their technologies are life-supporting technologies. They're not ones where you're blowing things up, digging things out of the ground, burning coal and oil and chopping down things. You're using these advanced technologies and you develop a world, and this is where we're headed. We should have been there 100 years ago, but we're running out of time. Now we need to pick up the pace and do what I call a time snap, where we regain where we should have been 100 years ago in 20 years, 15, 20 years. So that's a level 1 civilization, and you imagine, at that point, there's no pollution, there's no poverty, the work week probably drops 10 to 15 hours a week.
Yep.
There's abundance. It's a totally different economic system, environmental system, and justice system, social system, where, there's just not the have and have-nots because there's total abundance due to these advanced technologies that create endless abundance. So at that point, there's the possibility of a permanent peace, a level 2. Now, the thing about permanent peace means that you're not just becoming peaceful and slipping back. And a permanent peace requires a certain level of conscious, spiritual, and social integration. And this is where you develop transdimensional technologies. They're only being used for peaceful purposes. We've talked about before, travel, going from point A to B with anti-grav. Here's a beautiful part of that. Once people are freed from the shackles of the macroeconomic system we're in, which actually is sort of like an extension of slavery industrially, you have the ability to have people really pursue higher states of consciousness. Why? Because they're freed up. They're not working. Both parents aren't working 40, 50, 60 hours a week. So there's the ability to engage in creative endeavors, pursue higher states of consciousness, and really develop your spirituality. It becomes practical to do. So, and then, that will allow you to evolve and be ready for clearance, for takeoff, to become an interstellar civilization. That's a level 3 civilization. You are a interstellar civilization because you've been stable. You're peaceful. You're not engaging in weapon systems in space. There's widespread establishment of the science of consciousness, and the integration between your world and other worlds begins to happen overtly, openly. And my sense is that probably in the next 1,000 years, Earth will be fully integrated into these other interstellar civilizations that are at that level, a 3 or above. And then a level 4 civilization, this gets into where you're really developing higher states of consciousness, because at a level 4, you have at least 1% of the population in cosmic consciousness, very high enlightened state. Not everybody, but at least 1%. And that creates an effect on the entire population, again, through this 1% effect that is non-local. And these are the senior ambassadors that we've had encounters and meetings with that are in an enlightened state of cosmic consciousness. Like I mentioned, kindness, Bijou, the healer, they're all in those very high states of consciousness. And contact with other advanced civilizations is their primary purpose. They are literally ambassadors to the universe. It's the CE5 project I have called, we're ambassadors to the universe. And they also provide guidance to emerging civilizations and kind of oversee and be sure that they don't go too far in a direction that could harm other planets. And that's, you see some of the civilizations that are here are at that level where they're trying to be sure we don't have too much damage that emerges from Earth to other places. And then, level 5 civilization is getting very rarefied. Now, this is a civilization where everyone on the planet is in cosmic consciousness. They're born into enlightenment, because we don't have time to go into the epigenetic effects of consciousness on the body and on the genes and how it's passed on from one generation to another. But I'll just give you a hint. When you are in a meditative state, but you're in a very high meditative state, it alters your genetic and neuroplasticity of your brain, but that's passed on in one generation. So then you have the entire planet has become enlightened, truly, in cosmic consciousness. And so this then leads to the widespread and accelerated experience of innate cities and the parallel of those being applied technologically, in almost everything that planet is doing. So when you go back to what I shared a moment ago, that becomes just the way of life, And then a level 6 civilization, this is when many people experience some of those ET beings almost at a celestial level, because that's when at least 1% of that world are in a state of God consciousness permanently. And that affects everything else, and where their technologies almost reach a refinement of the celestial. But it's technological, and they're from a planet. Very, very. They often get confused with an angel, but they all have a craft with them. So this is where there's a lot of confusion. I call it cosmological indigestion that happens because there is overlap of experiences people have with beings from other dimensions with these very, very highly developed civilizations that are out there. And the physical world of those planets takes literally on the quality of a celestial realm. So it can be physical, but also has this celestial quality. And their spacecraft too. And then you have from there, in this natural progression, at level 7, everyone on the planet from birth is in God consciousness. Number 7, that's where humans will be in about 300,000 to 500,000 years. By the end of this yuga, this cycle, this entire planet will be inhabited by beings like that, by us having our progeny, 20,000 generations in the future. It's really very beautiful. And at that point, that civilization really correlates to the celestial realm. They can phase by intent from 3D to celestial. The world and the craft, all of it. And it's a very exalted state of civilization. And then at level 8 civilization, this is where you have all the technologies are interfacing at a celestial level. I mean, everything on the planet. Not just the advanced ambassadors and starships, but the entire manifestation of their planet. And really, it's then by thought, everything happens. You materialize, do everything just exactly like you've heard in these higher celestial realms, but they're in a planetary system. And they can then choose, by the way, to be in the universe we think of or in this higher celestial dimension. And then now we're going to get into some extremely advanced civilizations, level 9, where you have about 1% of that population that are in Brahman consciousness, universal consciousness. The ambassadors and guardians of entire emerging worlds are from that level. I call them the primogenitors of life and the protectors of the development of life throughout the cosmos. And then level 10, everyone in that civilization is in Brahman consciousness.
It's just incredible. This is so beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful where we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 1,000%.
Yep.
Thank you, Dr. Greer. That was amazing.
Thank you.
I'm Billy Carson. Thank you for watching Disclosure with Dr. Stephen Greer.